5 days ago, my sister slapped me at a gala packed with wealthy elites. The room went dead silent, as if witnessing a crash. She assumed it was a quick humiliation everyone would forget. She did not realize I do not strike back with my hands. I retaliate with paperwork, audits, and the law. Now, on day 5, my phone rings with her screaming in absolute panic. It is far too late to turn back. My name is Isla Hayes, at 37 years old. I am a senior financial risk management executive at Northline Fiduciary Group. In my professional life, I routinely dismantle corporate disasters, untangling liabilities and stabilizing portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I am calibrated for high-pressure environments. I am trained to remain entirely stoic when the numbers plummet and the boardroom descends into chaos. Yet, for all my expertise in mitigating catastrophic loss, I had no contingency plan for being violently struck across the face by my own flesh and blood in a room full of Seattle's wealthiest elites. The evening began exactly as these exhausting family obligations always did. We were at a lavish charity gala held at a pristine harborfront venue. The sprawling ballroom was a sea of bespoke tuxedos, glittering diamonds, and calculated smiles. Corporate sponsors, local media anchors, and influential philanthropists mingled under towering crystal chandeliers, while the gentle sway of the docked yachts provided a picturesque backdrop beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. I was not there to socialize. I was there because our mother, Diane Hayes, sat as an honorary member on the foundation's board, and she expected her family to serve as the perfect supporting cast. Naturally, I was relegated to the shadows, managing the chaotic backstage logistics and ensuring the silent auction ran smoothly. Meanwhile, my younger sister, Brielle Hayes, treated the philanthropic event as her personal runway. Brielle had deliberately chosen a breathtaking, floor-length white couture gown for the occasion. It was an absurdly ostentatious choice for a charity dinner, designed explicitly to capture the spotlight and ensure every camera lens gravitated toward her. She thrived on that attention, feeding on the compliments of the 200 guests while I quietly directed caterers and smoothed over scheduling hiccups. The incident occurred just past 9 o'clock. I had stepped out from the staging area to deliver a revised bidding sheet to the auctioneer. The ballroom was lively, filled with the hum of sophisticated networking and a smooth jazz quartet playing in the corner. As I navigated the narrow space between the VIP tables, a heavily intoxicated real estate developer stumbled backward. He lost his footing, colliding violently into my shoulder. The impact threw me off balance, sending me crashing directly into Brielle, who had been posing for a photographer nearby. I could not catch myself in time. The fluted glass of vintage champagne in my hand tipped, splashing a bright, golden arc of alcohol directly across the pristine white silk of Brielle's expensive gown. For a fraction of a second, time seemed to freeze. I opened my mouth to apologize, to explain that the man behind me had shoved me, but Brielle did not ask what happened. She did not look at the swaying drunk man stumbling away. She only looked at the stain on her dress, then at me, her eyes flashing with a familiar, terrifying rage. Without a single word of warning, she raised her hand and struck me. The slap was vicious. The sharp, explosive crack of her palm hitting my cheek echoed like a gunshot over the gentle jazz music. The force of it snapped my head to the side, leaving a burning, stinging heat radiating across my skin. Instantly, the entire room went dead silent. The jazz quartet faltered and stopped playing. Dozens of conversations died in the throats of the city's most powerful people. Forks hovered over porcelain plates. Every single eye in our vicinity locked onto us. "You always ruin everything," Brielle shrieked, her voice tearing through the suffocating silence. Her face was contorted in fury, tears of pure entitlement welling in her eyes as she frantically clawed at the ruined fabric of her dress. "You are completely jealous of me. You did this on purpose. You miserable wretch." She was screaming, painting herself as the tragic victim of my supposed malice. Even though at least 20 people had clearly seen the drunk guest push me, it did not matter to her. The truth had never mattered to Brielle when a dramatic narrative was available. before I could even process the throbbing pain in my jaw. Our mother materialized from the crowd. Diane Hayes rushed forward, panic etched into her perfectly lifted features, but her panic was not for me. She did not look at the red welt rapidly swelling on my face. She did not ask if I was hurt. She dropped to her knees beside Brielle, desperately dabbing at the soaked silk with a linen napkin. "Oh, my poor darling," Diane cooed, completely ignoring the fact that her youngest daughter had just assaulted her oldest. Then, my mother snapped her head up and glared at me with absolute disgust. "Isla, look at what you have done. Apologize to your sister right this instant. You are making an absolute scene in front of the board." I stood frozen, the stinging in my cheek matched only by the suffocating tightness in my chest. I looked past my mother and sister, searching the crowd for our father. Graham Hayes was standing just 10 feet away, holding a scotch on the rocks. He saw the entire exchange. He saw the slap, but his posture remained entirely rigid. His face was a mask of cold, calculated preservation. He made a deliberate choice in that exact second to protect the golden child and preserve his own public dignity rather than defend me. His eyes met mine, chilling and dismissive, silently ordering me to leave and stop embarrassing them. They expected me to break. They expected me to cry, to apologize, to fall into the same submissive role I had played for nearly 4 decades. I did none of those things. I did not utter a single word of defense. I did not shed a single tear. I simply straightened my posture, smoothed the front of my understated black suit, and turned on my heel. The sea of shocked guests parted for me as I walked toward the exit. The silence was heavy, but the clarity in my mind was absolute. As I stepped out into the crisp Seattle night air, leaving the harbor venue behind, the emotional devastation began to recede, instantly replaced by the cold, calculating instincts of a financial risk manager. My family had always relied on me to fix their messes, taking my money and my silence for granted. They thought they had just slapped a dutiful, obedient daughter. They were completely unaware that they had just struck the sole architect of their fragile financial survival. As the valet brought my car around, the scattered, chaotic pieces of my family's hidden financial history began snapping together in my mind, forming a very clear, very dangerous picture. The drive across the floating bridge back to my apartment in Bellevue was supposed to be my escape route, but the rhythmic, hypnotic hum of the tires against the dark asphalt served only to sharpen my focus. The physical sting on my left cheek was already fading into a dull, pulsing throb. Yet it had triggered a mechanism deep within my mind that could not be turned off. I was not speeding away into the night to hide from my humiliation. I was not going home to cry into a glass of wine or draft a furious, emotionally unhinged message to my parents. I was driving away to calculate the exact cost of their betrayal. For 8 long, exhausting years, I had served as the invisible, unappreciated load-bearing pillar of the Hayes family. It all started when our father made a catastrophic, arrogant miscalculation in a massive commercial real estate venture. He had over-leveraged every single asset he possessed, borrowing against the family home and draining his retirement accounts. When the local property market contracted sharply, he was left staring directly down the barrel of total, irrecoverable financial ruin. It was I who had stepped into the wreckage. I had quietly drained my own early investment portfolios, liquidating stable assets to generate cash. I utilized every ounce of my professional leverage and negotiating skill to quietly restructure his mounting debt, effectively saving our family name from public bankruptcy and societal humiliation. I did not do it because they were particularly deserving of my sacrifice, nor did I do it out of overwhelming familial love. I did it because I foolishly believed that keeping the household quiet and stable was the only way to ensure my own peace of mind. That exact same misguided sense of duty was how I ended up bankrolling my younger sister. When Brielle decided she wanted to play the role of a glamorous chief executive officer, she came to me with tears in her eyes, Presenting a half-baked vision board filled with magazine clippings of wedding dresses, I single-handedly funded the launch of Lace and Ember Bridal from the ground up. I provided the initial seed capital, secured the vital vendor lines of credit, and meticulously structured the foundational operating agreements. However, I was a seasoned risk manager, not a benevolent fairy godmother. My capital came with strict, non-negotiable legal conditions. I demanded fully transparent quarterly reporting, absolute adherence to strict budgetary limits, and total risk control remaining firmly and undeniably in my hands. Naturally, the narrative our parents spun to their wealthy country club friends and local socialites was entirely different. To hear my mother tell it over lunch. Brielle was a brilliant self-made entrepreneur who had built her luxury bridal empire through sheer creative genius and relentless hustle. I, on the other hand, was merely the dry, unimaginative older sister who occasionally looked over her spreadsheets when asked. I allowed them their comfortable delusions for years. I let Brielle play the glamorous founder while I remained the silent shadow, watching the ledgers and ensuring the lights stayed on. The moment I stepped inside my quiet, immaculate apartment, I did not bother turning on the main lights. I bypassed the kitchen entirely and walked straight into my home office, guided by the glow of the city skyline through the windows. I dropped to my knees and entered the complex numerical combination into the heavy steel safe bolted securely beneath my mahogany desk. The thick metal door clicked open with a heavy thud. I reached past my personal tax files and pulled out a thick black leather binder. It contained the complete, unvarnished legal truth of Lace and Ember Bridal. I spread the heavy watermark documents across the smooth surface of my desk. I ran my fingers over the capital contribution contracts, the asset mortgage rights, and the comprehensive account authorization forms. I flipped to the morality and business ethics clauses I had painstakingly drafted into her operating agreement, clauses designed specifically to protect my investment from her impulsive nature. There was a fundamental reality my family had conveniently chosen to forget over the years. I was not merely an angel investor who could be publicly swatted away when my presence became inconvenient. Through a complex corporate restructuring maneuver I had executed 3 years prior to shield my personal capital, I had established Harbor Crest Holdings Limited Liability Company. It was a private holding firm solely owned, directed, and managed by me. What Brielle and my parents willfully ignored was that Harbor Crest Holdings was the precise legal entity that owned the commercial lease for the sprawling, expensive Lace and Ember flagship showroom downtown. I did not just hold a minority equity stake in her brand, I literally owned the legal rights to the ground she stood on. I was her landlord, and I held the unilateral power to evict her operations if she breached the terms of our master agreement. Sitting in the profound silence of my office, I opened my laptop and deliberately bypassed her standard administrative dashboard. Instead, I logged directly into the back-end financial portals I had mandated she use from day one. My eyes scanned the raw data columns, and the scattered pieces of the puzzle began to snap together with chilling, undeniable clarity. Her routine profit and loss reports were unusually delayed, lingering in a pending status for weeks. For the past 4 months, Brielle had been aggressively badgering me for additional capital injections. She constantly cited suddenly surging marketing costs and unforeseen supply chain disruptions as the reason for the cash burn. I had firmly denied the last 2 requests, explicitly demanding itemized receipts and vendor invoices, which she had conveniently failed to produce. The vicious slap at the gala suddenly felt less like a spoiled tantrum and more like a warning flare. Brielle was not simply angry about a ruined dress. She was hiding something, and whatever it was, had already pushed her well past panic. Most ordinary people would have reacted to a public assault with immediate, emotional retaliation. They would have called the authorities, engaged in a screaming match, or aired the dirty family grievances all over the internet. I am not most people. I am a highly trained specialist in neutralizing catastrophic financial liabilities. I closed my eyes for a brief, final moment, letting the very last remnants of my familial loyalty evaporate into the cold, clinical air of my office. When I opened my eyes again, the wounded sister was gone. and only the senior risk manager remained. I initiated my standard crisis protocol. Emotion was a severe liability. Documentation was absolute power. I would not strike back blindly in anger. Instead, I would first lock down the perimeter, preserve every single shred of digital and financial evidence, and build an impenetrable fortress of undeniable proof. Then, and only then, would I initiate the confrontation. The board was already set, and my sister had absolutely no idea that she was stepping into a trap she had built herself. At exactly 7 a.m, the emotional numbness had fully crystallized into operational efficiency. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line of my private attorney. Nolan Pike. Nolan is not a family lawyer. He is a corporate litigator who specializes in hostile takeovers and asset recovery, a man who views sentimentality as a structural weakness. When he answered, I bypassed any standard morning greetings. I instructed him to immediately initiate an emergency, comprehensive review of every single dollar tied to my investments in my sister's company. My first directive was to issue a sweeping legal hold notice. This was not a polite request for information. It was a binding, aggressive legal mandate served to the company's registered agent, demanding the absolute preservation of all corporate records. I mandated that every email server, text message log, electronic invoice, and accounting software backup related to the business be frozen intact. Anyone caught deleting a single file after receiving that notice would be committing spoliation of evidence, a severe legal offense. I wanted a digital net thrown over the entire operation before anyone could hit the delete key. Next, I opened my secure credential portal. 2 years prior, in a rare moment of seeking efficiency over security, I had granted her internal accounting department restricted access to a digital scan of my signature. It was intended strictly for expediting routine vendor approvals without requiring my physical presence. With 3 keystrokes, I permanently revoked that administrative privilege. The authorization was instantly voided. From this exact second forward, any document bearing my name would require fresh, verifiable, biometric authentication. I then placed a priority call to my wealth manager at the partner bank. For the past year, I had maintained a safety protocol, an automated financial sweep that transferred funds from my personal reserve accounts to her operational ledger whenever her balance dipped below a certain threshold. It was a safety net designed to prevent bounced payroll checks. I ordered the bank to sever that connection immediately. The pipeline was officially sealed dry. Zero capital would flow from my accounts to hers. With the financial bleeding stopped, I turned my attention to the commercial lease. I pulled the master agreement between her brand and my holding company. I scanned the dense legal text until I found the exact clause I needed. Section 4 of the lease explicitly stipulated that the tenant must provide accurate, verifiable financial reporting as a condition of occupying the commercial space. Submitting materially false reports, or deliberately obscuring financial distress, constituted an immediate, incurable breach of contract. She was already late on her deliverables, and the numbers she had previously submitted were highly suspect. I had the legal grounds to issue a formal notice of default. However, I knew my family. I knew their predictable tactics. The moment I tightened the financial noose, they would rush to the court of public opinion. They would attempt to paint me as a vindictive, emotionally unhinged sister seeking revenge for a public altercation, to completely neutralize that narrative. I spent the next hour drafting a meticulous internal memorandum. I documented that every single action I was taking today was based entirely on my strict fiduciary duty to protect my holding company and my capital investments. I cited the delayed reports, the repeated and undocumented requests for additional cash, and the blatant violations of the operating agreement. I built an impenetrable paper trail proving that my response was not a petty family squabble. It was a calculated, legally required corporate risk management procedure. I was acting as an executive, not a sister. To prove the financial discrepancies, I needed an independent expert with no emotional stake in the outcome. I called Maren Cole. We had known each other for 15 years. Maren is an independent forensic accountant who can spot a laundered invoice from a mile away. I did not give her the emotional backstory. I simply hired her firm on an emergency retainer and gave her a single, focus directive. I told her to ruthlessly audit the marketing and promotional expense ledgers for the trailing 18 months. I told her to look for the ghosts in the machine. The board was set. The perimeter was locked down. I felt a cold sense of control returning to my fingertips. Then, at 2 p.m, my phone rang. It was a vice president from the Fraud and Security Division of my partner bank. During their expedited review of the accounts, the banking team had flagged a series of highly irregular transactions. They had discovered multiple merchant cash advances. These were not standard commercial loans. They were incredibly toxic. Predatory lending instruments where a desperate business owner sells their future credit card receivables at an exorbitant, crippling discount just to get fast cash today. They are the financial equivalent of a payday loan, a desperate measure taken by a company gasping for its final breaths. The vice president informed me that 3 separate massive cash advances had been approved and deposited over the last 90 days. I asked him how that was mathematically possible, considering the operating agreement strictly forbade taking on outside debt without my explicit, notarized consent as the primary investor. The silence on the line stretched out for an agonizing moment before the vice president spoke again. He stated that the lending agreements had been fully executed and guaranteed. They had been signed using the digital scan of my signature. I sat perfectly still, staring at the blank wall of my home office. I had never seen those documents. I had never authorized those loans. The air in the room suddenly felt freezing cold. The violent public assault the night before completely morphed in my mind. It was no longer the arrogant strike of a spoiled sibling protecting her spotlight. It was the erratic, terrifying panic of a cornered criminal. She was drowning in toxic debt, and she had used my name to dig the hole deeper. The public humiliation was merely a distraction, the tiny, visible tip of a massive, catastrophic financial forgery that was now ticking down to detonation. By the afternoon of the second day, Maren Cole sat across from me in the sterile light of my office, a mountain of printed ledgers separating us. The preliminary forensic audit was not merely bad. It was a masterclass in desperation. Maren bypassed all standard pleasantries and slid a highlighted spreadsheet directly toward me. She pointed her pen to a column labeled as bridal display costs. On paper, these were massive, recurring expenditures supposedly wired to elite European textile vendors. In reality, Maren had traced the digital routing numbers. The capital was never crossing the Atlantic Ocean. It was bleeding into a series of domestic intermediary accounts that possessed absolutely zero connection to the bridal industry. I leaned closer, my eyes scanning the vendor names. It was insultingly sloppy. There were sequential invoice numbers generated months apart, an absolute statistical impossibility for a high-volume supplier. There were supplier names deliberately misspelled by a single vowel to mimic legitimate Parisian fashion houses. When Maren ran the billing addresses, they did not map to warehouses or tailoring ateliers. They pointed directly to virtual mailboxes located in anonymous strip malls. These were fabricated invoices, the oldest, most desperate trick in the corporate embezzler's handbook. Then, my eyes caught something Maren had circled in thick red ink. It was a recurring monthly outgoing wire classified vaguely as a consulting retainer. I immediately pulled the corporate registry for the payee. A shadowy entity named Apex Strategy Group. The registered agent was not a bridal consultant. It was a man Brielle had dated 2 years prior. A man who possessed zero background in fashion, logistics, or business management. She was actively funneling my company capital into a shell account controlled by her ex-boyfriend. The systemic rot extended far beyond fake vendors. We cross-referenced the point-of-sale data with the actual warehouse inventory logs. The customs import records clearly indicated that a massive volume of high-end gowns had been shipped, taxed, and paid for. Yet, the physical receiving logs at her showroom reflected less than half of that volume. The conclusion was undeniable. Brielle was operating a ghost business. She was receiving the expensive merchandise, selling a massive portion of it completely off the books for untraceable cash, and leaving the empty liabilities sitting squarely on my balance sheet. Up until this exact second, I was treating this disaster as a localized containment breach. I was simply managing a rogue executive who happened to be my sister. Then, Marin slid a single, highly distinct bank routing trace across the mahogany desk. This document felt physically different. The origin of the funds was not a commercial bank loan or a vendor credit line. The origin account belonged to the Harbor Charity Foundation. The transaction was categorized internally as a temporary logistics advance for the gala event. The financial trail showed the capital bouncing out from the charity trust, washing quickly through a temporary holding account, and depositing directly into the Lace and Ember operational fund to quietly cover a glaring payroll deficit. I stared intently at the authorization signature block. My vision tunneled, the edges of the room blurring into insignificance. The signature did not belong to Brielle. It belonged to Diane Hayes. A profound, suffocating weight settled heavily into my chest, a pain infinitely sharper and vastly more destructive than the physical strike I had endured at the gala. My own mother had deliberately abused her fiduciary power on the charity board to illegally divert nonprofit funds, all to keep her golden child afloat. This single piece of paper completely shattered my entire understanding of our family dynamic. My mother was not simply playing emotional favorites or turning a blind, loving eye to a spoiled daughter. She was an active, willing accomplice in corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. She had compromised a charitable trust to protect Brielle's manufactured image, all while entirely expecting me to eventually foot the bill and clean up the wreckage. "It actually gets worse," Marin stated quietly, her voice shattering the heavy, toxic silence in the room. She pulled up the real-time banking telemetry. Those merchant cash advances I had discovered the day before were not sitting dormant. The predatory private lenders were aggressively sweeping the showroom's accounts on a daily basis. Brielle was paying astronomical, crippling daily interest rates just to keep the lights on. Marin explained that these specific, ruthless lenders only deploy this level of aggressive daily collection when a debtor is in severe, critical default. They had a financial noose tightly wrapped around Brielle's throat. She was completely out of runway, likely mere days away from a total, catastrophic asset seizure by private creditors. The picture was now fully painted in blood and ink. Brielle was a cornered animal. If I approached her haphazardly, if I sent a threatening text message or knocked angrily on her front door, she would panic. A panicked embezzler destroys evidence. She would frantically wipe the digital servers, burn the physical ledgers, and orchestrate a chaotic, screaming public meltdown to muddy the waters and play the victim. I could not allow her the space to control the narrative. I needed to build a legal cage so tight she would not even realize she was trapped until the heavy steel door locked securely behind her. I looked at Marin, thanking her for the preliminary intelligence. I picked up my phone and drafted a secure message to Nolan Pike. I instructed him to prepare the main conference room at Northline Fiduciary Group for the following morning. I requested our internal corporate compliance officer to be present in the room. I explicitly ordered the installation of legal visible audio and video recording equipment, strictly adhering to the state's two-party consent laws. I was going to invite my family to my absolute professional domain. I would present them with a stage, an audience, and the cold, unforgiving light of the truth. They truly believed they could manage me. Tomorrow, they would learn exactly what happens when you force a risk manager to audit her own blood. The morning of the third day began with the exact type of theatrical chaos I had fully anticipated. At precisely 9 o'clock, the serene, marble-floored reception area of Northline Fiduciary Group was shattered by the shrill echoes of my sister's voice. I was standing near the glass security gates when I heard her screaming at the front desk concierge. My parents flanked her like overprotective bodyguards. Brielle was dramatically weeping, loudly proclaiming to anyone within earshot that her cruel, ungrateful older sister was trying to destroy our entire family out of petty jealousy over one single, meaningless slap. Several high-net-worth clients and junior analysts paused in the corridors, staring in shock at the spectacle unfolding in our pristine lobby. I did not move toward her. Instead, I caught the eye of our head of building security and gave him a curt nod. I was not going to turn my lobby into a family shouting match. Within seconds, 2 uniformed guards smoothly corralled my hysterical family toward the private executive elevators. I instructed the guards to escort them directly to our most secure, soundproof meeting space on the top floor. I absolutely refused to allow them to contaminate my professional sanctuary or disrupt my staff. When I opened the heavy oak door to the conference room 10 minutes later, the dynamic shifted instantly. This was no longer a familial battleground. It was my arena. Sitting on one side of the expansive mahogany table was my attorney, Nolan Pike, looking as rigid and unforgiving as a stone statue. Next to him sat our internal corporate compliance director, a silent witness holding a yellow legal pad. In the very center of the table, a professional audio recording device sat illuminated with a solid red light before anyone could utter a word. I formally announced that per state law, this entire conversation was being recorded for legal and compliance purposes. My mother opened her mouth in outrage, ready to protest the formality, but Brielle slammed her hands flat against the polished wood. "Turn the money back on right now, Isla," Brielle demanded, her voice trembling with a toxic mixture of fury and absolute panic. Her designer makeup was slightly smudged, her expensive tweed jacket wrinkled from distress. "You have absolutely no right to freeze my accounts. I have massive vendor payments due before the weekend. You are literally ruining my life because you cannot handle being embarrassed at a party." I did not raise my voice in response. I simply picked up a sleek black remote from the table and pressed a single button. The motorized shades on the floor-to-ceiling windows descended, plunging the room into shadow. A massive projection screen dropped silently from the ceiling. With another click, I illuminated the wall with a high-definition image of Marin Cole's forensic audit findings. "I froze the accounts because you are committing massive, systemic fraud," I stated calmly, letting the accusation hang in the chilled air. I advanced the slides one by one. I projected the fabricated invoices from the fake European vendors, placing the misspelled company names and empty virtual mailbox addresses side by side for everyone to read. I pulled up the merchant cash advance contracts, highlighting the exorbitant daily interest rates and the predatory terms. Then, I magnified the digital scan of my signature that had been illegally pasted onto the bottom of those loan guarantees. My father, Graham, had entered the room with a look of severe annoyance, fully prepared to scold me for causing a fuss. Now, as he stared at the undeniable proof of forged financial instruments, the color completely drained from his face. He was a seasoned businessman. He understood exactly what those documents meant. The arrogant, dismissive patriarch was suddenly replaced by a man realizing he was sitting in a room with multiple felonies. He realized this was infinitely larger than a family quarrel. I clicked to the final slide. The screen glowed with the wire transfer logs from the Harbor Charity Foundation, showing the exact route the nonprofit funds took before landing in Brielle's depleted payroll account. I zoomed in on the authorization signature block. Diane Hayes gasped sharply, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. Her eyes widened in absolute terror as her own signature, authorizing the illegal diversion of charity funds, loomed over us. She shrank back into her heavy leather chair, her pristine socialite facade crumbling into dust right before my eyes. She looked frantically at my father, but he refused to even meet her gaze. Brielle, however, lacked the basic intellect to understand the gravity of the snare she was caught in. Instead of remaining silent, she became feral. "You do not understand anything," Brielle shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at the projection screen. "If I do not pay them by Friday, they will destroy the entire expo. They will lock the doors and seize the inventory right in front of the press." The entire room went dead silent. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic hum of the projector fan. Nolan Pike subtly shifted in his chair, his silver pen pausing over his legal pad. With one furious, unthinking outburst, my sister had just inadvertently confessed on tape. She had publicly verified the existence of aggressive, outside shadow creditors pressuring her. More damningly, her confession proved her exact priorities. She did not care about the forged signatures, the stolen charity money, or the massive legal jeopardy she had placed our mother in. Her only concern was saving face at her glamorous bridal exposition scheduled for the end of the week. She was entirely willing to burn us all down just to keep her spotlight shining for a few more days. I turned off the projector. The sudden darkness forced them to look directly at me. "Here is the reality of your situation," I said, my voice cold, precise, and entirely devoid of sisterly affection. "You have exactly 24 hours to grant my auditing team full administrative access to every single server, warehouse log, and communication platform your company uses. You will surrender your company laptops and corporate phones to my compliance team by tomorrow morning." My mother began to sob quietly, a pathetic, trembling sound, but I ignored her. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Brielle. "If you attempt to stall, if you delete a single email, or if you fail to comply with this audit by this time tomorrow," I continued, delivering my first and final ultimatum, "I will take this entire binder, the audio recordings, and the forensic trace data directly to the District Economic Crimes Division. I will not protect you. I will not fund you. The choice is yours." The confrontation in the executive suite had permanently fractured the facade of my family. But the true structural collapse of their operation began late on the evening of the third day. I remained at my desk long after the rest of the floor had emptied, the city lights of Bellevue reflecting off the glass walls of my office. I was no longer merely reviewing spreadsheets. I was actively hunting for the bottom of a seemingly endless abyss. I received an encrypted data dump directly from the warehouse management system, a back-end portal Brielle had entirely forgotten I could access. I spent 3 hours cross-referencing the shipping manifests against the physical intake logs, and a glaring, massive anomaly emerged regarding the bespoke, premium-tier bridal gowns. These were not off-the-rack garments. These were imported, custom-designed dresses commanding tens of thousands of dollars apiece. According to the international shipping manifests, dozens of these high-value items had successfully cleared customs and arrived at the port over the past 6 months. However, they had never once been logged into the main showroom's inventory system. They simply vanished into thin air the very moment they touched domestic soil. My private cell phone vibrated sharply at 8 o'clock that night. The caller identification displayed an unrecognized local number. When I answered, the voice on the other end was quiet and laced with unmistakable terror. It belonged to a former inventory manager who had abruptly submitted her resignation 2 months prior. She told me she could no longer stomach the crushing anxiety of waiting for the authorities to knock on her door. In a trembling voice, she confessed that Brielle had explicitly and repeatedly ordered her to artificially inflate the physical stock numbers on the digital ledgers right before my mandatory quarterly financial reviews. Brielle had threatened to destroy her professional reputation in the local retail industry if she refused to manipulate the counts, armed with the former manager's testimony. I overlaid the missing inventory data with the predatory merchant cash advance contracts we had uncovered the previous day. A horrifying, multi-layered financial scheme materialized on my monitor. Brielle was not merely siphoning operational cash. She was utilizing the exact same physical inventory, and even the future customer deposit contracts, as collateral to secure emergency loans from 2 completely separate private financial entities simultaneously. She was engaging in aggressive, fraudulent cross-collateralization. She had effectively pledged the exact same dollar multiple times to different lenders. It was a catastrophic house of cards. If even one of those shadow lenders initiated a routine audit and realized the underlying collateral was either missing or already legally claimed by another institution, it would trigger an immediate, cascading chain default that would obliterate the company overnight. Just before midnight, the silence of my apartment was broken by another phone call. This time, the screen displayed my father's name. I let it ring 3 times before finally answering, foolishly bracing myself for a frantic apology or a desperate plea for mercy on behalf of our mother. I received absolutely nothing of the sort. Graham Hayes spoke in a hushed, conspiratorial tone, ensuring he was entirely out of earshot from his panicked wife and daughter. He did not ask how my face felt. He did not ask how I was holding up emotionally. He simply asked if there was any possible way we could make this whole thing go away quietly. He wanted to know exactly how much capital it would take to sweep the forged documents under the rug and keep the family name entirely out of the local business journals. A suffocating, freezing realization washed over me, chilling me to the bone. My father had known. He might not have been privy to the exact logistical mechanics of the charity fund diversion, but he absolutely knew the catastrophic depths of Brielle's short-term debt. He had known she was drowning, and he had deliberately turned a blind eye, silently encouraging her to find a quick fix, even if that fix meant forging his eldest daughter's signature. Preserving his immaculate social reputation remained his only true religion, and he was entirely willing to sacrifice my financial security upon its altar. The morning of the fourth day brought a cold, gray Seattle drizzle, perfectly matching the heavy, unforgiving atmosphere inside my corporate conference room. Nolan Pike arrived precisely at 7 in the morning, carrying a fresh pot of black coffee and a hardened, ruthless battle plan. Nolan proposed a highly aggressive, dual-track legal strategy. The primary tier would focus exclusively on civil recovery. We needed to rapidly and legally seize absolute control of the physical assets, the bank accounts, and the corporate records to prevent Brielle from completely incinerating the business entity before the authorities arrived. The secondary tier involved quietly compiling a pristine, airtight referral package for the district attorney regarding the blatant wire fraud and forged financial instruments. I agreed to the fundamental framework of his plan, but I laid down one non-negotiable, intensely personal stipulation. I absolutely refused to execute a scorched-earth public lockdown that would instantly terminate the employment of dozens of innocent people. The showroom consultants, the seamstresses, and the warehouse staff had mortgages to pay and families to feed. They had absolutely no idea their chief executive officer was running a criminal syndicate. I demanded that Nolan structure the asset seizure to legally sever Brielle's personal liability from the operational floor team. I would not allow innocent workers to pay the ultimate price for my sister's impending incarceration. As Nolan and I finalized the asset preservation protocols, a secure notification popped up on my email server. It was a large video file forwarded by an anonymous media contact who had attended the charity gala. I clicked play, and the high-definition security footage filled my screen. It was captured from an elevated angle above the harbor venue, completely stripping away the chaotic noise and the jazz music of that night. The camera flawlessly tracked the entire altercation. I watched the intoxicated guests stumble into me. I watched the champagne arc through the air. And then, I watched my sister. Without the distraction of her shrieking voice, her body language was damning. It was not a reflexive reaction to a ruined dress. She glanced around the room, clocked the witnesses, and then struck. The footage captured deliberation, not impulse. By 4 in the afternoon on the fourth day, the rain had stopped, leaving a heavy, suffocating humidity over the entire city. I sat at my desk and instructed Nolan to transmit the final civil settlement proposal directly to my family's newly retained, highly panicked defense counsel. I did not draft this dense legal document out of a lingering sense of familial warmth or an urge to protect my parents. I drafted it as a calculated, clinical off-ramp. It was an exceptionally strict but entirely equitable compromise, designed specifically to salvage the underlying business operations and protect the dozens of innocent employees who desperately relied on those weekly paychecks. The stipulations I laid out were absolute and non-negotiable. First, Brielle was required to immediately step down from her position as chief executive officer. She had to surrender all corporate hardware, relinquish every administrative password to my compliance team, and sign a legally binding promissory note formally acknowledging the exact magnitude of her stolen debt. Finally, she had to agree to a heavily monitored, multi-year restitution schedule to repay the diverted funds. The requirements for my parents were equally unforgiving. Diane was given exactly 24 hours to tender a quiet, irrevocable resignation from the Charity Foundation's board of directors. Furthermore, she had to surrender her entire personal email archive to our forensic accounting team to help us patch the massive financial hole she had willingly blown through the nonprofit's treasury. For Graham, I demanded a sworn, notarized affidavit. He was required to document every single historical instance where he had leveraged his paternal authority to pressure me into quietly liquidating my own assets to cover their reckless liabilities. I needed his complicity permanently captured in ink. If they signed the documents and complied fully, I agreed to temporarily freeze the criminal referral to the district attorney. It was a brief, highly conditional window of amnesty. It would allow them to walk away with a tiny shred of public dignity and prevent a chaotic, highly publicized police raid from traumatizing the warehouse staff and showroom consultants. Their response arrived less than 1 hour later, not through their attorney, but via an unhinged, multi-party phone call that I forced Nolan to monitor and record. Brielle was absolutely incandescent with rage. She screamed through the speakerphone that I was actively trying to sabotage her entire career at the absolute worst possible moment. The Northwest Bridal Expo, the largest and most lucrative industry event of the entire year, was scheduled to open its doors the very next morning. She aggressively accused me of timing my corporate audit specifically to ruin her grand showcase, entirely ignoring the glaring fact that her own fraudulent cash advances and missing inventory had triggered this crisis. Instead of acting like a responsible adult and advising her daughter to accept the legal lifeline, my mother chimed in, her voice dripping with disappointed condescension. Diane accused me of being needlessly rigid and cruel. She complained bitterly that forcing her off the charity board would cause a catastrophic social embarrassment among her wealthy country club peers. My mother was staring directly down the barrel of a federal wire fraud indictment. Yet she was genuinely more concerned about missing the annual spring luncheon. She still believed this was merely an ugly dispute over family pride, utterly incapable of comprehending that the federal penal code does not care about our social status or our last name. I terminated the call without offering a single word of rebuttal. The ultimate betrayal materialized exactly 2 hours later. My corporate public relations monitor flagged a rapidly trending post on a highly popular Seattle business and society forum. It was published by an anonymous user, but the vicious, hyper-specific vocabulary belonged unmistakably to my sister. The lengthy post painted a tragic, entirely fabricated narrative of a brilliant, hard-working young designer whose jealous, corporate raider older sister was utilizing complex legal loopholes to orchestrate a hostile takeover of her beloved boutique. It was a blatant, pathetic attempt to weaponize public sympathy and poison my professional reputation before the expo began. I felt absolutely no anger reading the slanderous paragraphs on my monitor. Anger requires surprise, and Brielle was agonizingly predictable. I ignored the bait. Rather than sparring in the comments, I instructed my legal team to release a single, painfully dry press bulletin to the local media outlets. The statement simply noted that Northline Fiduciary Group was currently conducting an independent financial audit of the bridal brand due to internal compliance irregularities, and we would provide absolutely no further comment on active, pending investigations. It was a corporate checkmate. The dry, legalistic truth instantly neutralized her dramatic fiction. As the sun dipped below the Seattle skyline, casting long, dark shadows across my office floor, a profound sense of finality settled over me. I had unlocked the door and shown my family the only safe way out of their burning building. Instead of walking through it, they had chosen to douse the remaining bridge in gasoline and light a match. Brielle had categorically rejected her final opportunity for salvation. The massive bridal expo tomorrow morning was no longer a glamorous showcase of her talent. It was a ticking time bomb, and there was absolutely nothing left to stop the detonation. The morning of the 5th day dawned with brilliant, unseasonably clear blue skies over the city. It was the opening day of the Northwest Bridal Expo, the absolute crown jewel of the local wedding industry. From my quiet, elevated office miles away, I knew exactly how the massive convention center floor looked. I knew Brielle had arrived early, flanked by her exhausted staff, wrapped in a perfectly tailored pastel blazer. She would be smiling her brightest, most practiced smile, completely ignoring the legal avalanche suspended directly above her head. Her strategy was transparently desperate. She intended to aggressively secure massive cash deposits from hundreds of newly engaged brides, hoping to funnel that fresh capital straight into her gaping financial wounds. I never went to the convention center. I did not need a public spectacle to dismantle her world. I sat at my desk with my attorney, Nolan Pike, and began severing her lifelines one by one. At exactly 9 a.m, the expo doors opened to the public. Simultaneously, I authorized the immediate digital execution of our prepared legal strikes. The formal notice of commercial lease violation was electronically served to her corporate inbox and physically taped to the locked glass doors of her flagship showroom downtown. A sweeping data preservation order locked down her entire cloud storage network. With a few keystrokes, I permanently revoked her administrative privileges to every single investor-owned software platform, effectively blinding her operational dashboard. 30 minutes later, the first major structural pillar collapsed. Brielle attempted to swipe a $5,000 deposit from a wealthy client at her expo booth. The transaction processed on the client end, but the capital never reached Brielle. I had already contacted the primary merchant processor. Submitting the forensic proof of her impending insolvency, the processing company immediately enacted a total revenue hold to protect themselves against the inevitable chargebacks and outstanding debts. Every single dollar she managed to swipe that day was instantly diverted into an inaccessible escrow account. She was collecting money she could never touch, completely neutralizing her final desperate attempt to pay off her shadow lenders. Before she could even finish screaming at the merchant support hotline, her secondary phone rang. It was not a vendor or a bride. It was an aggressive claims investigator from her commercial insurance provider. Nolan had flagged a highly suspicious, 5-figure damage claim. Brielle had filed 6 months prior, citing a mysterious water leak that allegedly ruined a rack of imported silk gowns. The insurance investigator was now demanding an immediate, mandatory interview regarding the glaring inconsistencies in her original police report. Her web of lies was rapidly constricting, choking off her air supply from every conceivable angle. Then came the physical manifestation of her ruin. I did not send police officers to drag her out in handcuffs. I sent a professional, unsympathetic civil asset recovery team instead. 6 individuals wearing dark corporate polos and carrying heavy clipboards marched straight onto the bustling expo floor. They bypassed Brielle entirely and began adhering bright yellow asset seizure tags to the massive lighting rigs, the custom display racks, and the expensive electronic point-of-sale systems. They calmly informed the terrified event coordinators that those specific items were legally owned by my holding company and were now subject to immediate repossession due to contract default. Her frontline employees were utterly paralyzed. They stood in their branded uniforms, watching the repo team dismantle their booth while their chief executive officer hyperventilated in the corner. I had anticipated their panic. I had already dispatched 2 senior human resources representatives from Northline Fiduciary Group, dressed in plain clothes, to mingle near the perimeter. Whenever an employee stepped away from the chaos, my representatives quietly intercepted them. They handed over discreet envelopes containing legal assurances that any staff member who cooperated with the ongoing financial audit and distanced themselves from Brielle would receive immediate severance support and direct placement assistance with legitimate retail firms. I was actively evacuating the innocent crew before the ship finally sank into the abyss. The ultimate, earth-shattering twist occurred just past 11 in the morning. My parents had arrived at the convention center to offer Brielle moral support, determined to maintain the ridiculous illusion of a happy, successful family business. Graham Hayes marched up to the convention center cafe to purchase a round of coffees. He handed the barista his premium Family Reserve debit card. The machine aggressively beeped, flashing an insufficient funds error. My father was a man who prided himself on absolute financial control. He immediately opened his mobile banking application, fully expecting a minor security hold. Instead, he stared at a balance of absolute zero. The night before, while I was drafting her settlement agreement, Brielle had bypassed her frozen corporate accounts. She had utilized an old, emergency authorization code our father had given her years ago. She completely drained the last $50,000 of our parents' private emergency fund to pay the daily interest on her predatory loans. When Graham furiously confronted her in the middle of the crowded expo aisle, Brielle hysterically tried to blame me. She shrieked that Isla had locked everything, forcing her hand. For the very first time in my entire life, my father did not instinctively side with the golden child. The public humiliation he feared most was happening right in front of him. Orchestrated by his favorite daughter, Graham Hayes raised his voice, aggressively questioning her right there on the convention floor, demanding to know where his retirement capital had vanished to. The impenetrable wall of unconditional parental protection shattered into a million pieces under the bright fluorescent lights of the convention hall. Guests stopped and stared. Competitors from other bridal boutiques whispered and pointed. The pristine, untouchable image of Brielle Hayes was completely, publicly annihilated by noon. Her meticulously designed booth was half dismantled. Her staff was quietly abandoning their posts one by one. Her father had turned his back and walked out of the building in sheer disgust, leaving her mother weeping silently near a rack of unsold veils. Brielle stood entirely alone amidst the wreckage of her own arrogance. Her phone vibrated relentlessly against the small cocktail table. It was a chaotic, unending symphony of incoming calls from furious loan sharks, panicked clients demanding refunds, confused warehouse managers, and her own frantic defense attorneys. She stared at the glowing screen, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold a pen. Yet, despite the relentless ringing, her eyes remained wide with absolute, suffocating terror. She knew the entire system had crashed, but the one phone call she feared above all others, the final blow she knew was coming, had not yet arrived. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the blinding speed of truth finally overtook my sister's exhausting marathon of lies. The initial fallout at the convention center was merely the appetizer. The main course was served quietly, decisively, and with the full weight of the County Economic Crimes Division. Nolan Pike had transmitted a comprehensive, heavily redacted summary file to the district attorney's office that morning. It was just enough to trigger an immediate preliminary inquiry, prompting 2 plainclothes investigators and an extremely pale representative from the Harbor Charity Foundation to begin officially collecting documents. Back at the convention center, Brielle realized the walls were closing in faster than she could breathe. Around 1:30 in the afternoon, she abruptly abandoned her crumbling booth. She frantically told her remaining deeply confused staff that she had to step away to handle urgent private business. However, she was not going to the bank or calling her lawyer. She was making a desperate, panicked sprint to a discreet, climate-controlled storage facility located 20 miles outside the city limits. This was her shadow warehouse, the off-the-books location Maren Cole had flagged in the forensic sweep, where Brielle hid the unrecorded, premium inventory and her secondary ledger books. Unfortunately for her, she was not the only one heading there, based on the digital breadcrumbs we had legally obtained and shared. The county investigators had secured a rapid preservation order for that exact address. They intercepted her right as she fumbled with the heavy steel padlock on the unit door, when the authorities finally rolled up the metal door. The scope of her depravity was laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights of the storage unit. The space was packed with dozens of undeclared custom gowns. But that was not the twist that shattered our family forever. Tucked away in the back corner were heavy, locked display cases containing diamond necklaces, vintage tiaras, and antique silver centerpieces. These were items my sister had recorded in her ledgers as high-end props rented for the charity gala. They were not rentals. They were physical assets belonging exclusively to the Charity Foundation's archival vault. When the foundation representative confirmed the serial numbers on the jewelry, the investigator immediately called my mother into a separate room back at their downtown precinct for preliminary questioning. Diane Hayes was presented with the itemized list of the recovered physical assets, the blood entirely drained from her pristine face. Up until this exact moment, my mother had operated under the incredibly naive delusion that Brielle was merely juggling temporary cash flows, borrowing a few invisible digits on a screen that would eventually be replaced. Seeing the physical stolen charity diamonds meticulously hidden in her daughter's secret storage unit broke her. she finally realized the staggering federal magnitude of the crimes she had passively enabled. In an adjacent interrogation room, my father's carefully constructed armor was being systematically dismantled. An investigator slid a printed copy of an email chain from 8 months ago across the metal table. It was a communication between Graham and Brielle, explicitly discussing the delay in vendor payments. In the second paragraph, Brielle casually mentioned using the digital scan of my signature to expedite a contract, and my father replied with a brief, dismissive acknowledgement telling her to just get it done quickly. Cornered by his own digital footprint, Graham was forced to admit that he had known about the forgery for the better part of a year. He had deliberately turned a blind eye to a felony to avoid a messy confrontation. Panic is a highly effective solvent for familial loyalty. Desperate to protect his own lucrative consulting career and avoid accessory charges, Graham immediately began downplaying his involvement, insisting that his wife, Diane, handled all the charity logistics and was much closer to Brielle's daily operations. When the investigators pressed Diane on the same discrepancies, she hysterically contradicted him, screaming that Graham was the one who managed the family money and he had ordered her to approve the temporary charity advance to protect their social standing. Within 45 minutes, my parents had completely turned on each other. The united, impenetrable front of the Hayes family imploded right in front of the authorities, entirely destroying any remaining credibility they possessed. Through it all, I maintained my strategy. I never went to the precinct to gloat, and I refused every hallway shouting match. I said nothing in retaliation. I sat in my office at Northline Fiduciary Group with a cup of chamomile tea, letting every piece of communication flow through legal transcripts, sworn affidavits, and forensic ledgers. I let the absolute, terrifying power of the paper trail do the speaking for me. When Brielle finally realized that her parents had completely abandoned her to save their own skin, her survival instinct mutated into pure, venomous projection. Standing in the parking lot of the storage facility, with investigators logging her stolen inventory, she began screaming to anyone who would listen. She loudly proclaimed that I was the true mastermind, claiming I had deliberately starved her of capital and backed her into an impossible corner simply to execute a hostile takeover and steal her brand. It was a pathetic, transparent lie, the final dying breath of her fabricated reality. The afternoon shadows grew longer across the city. The final sequence was perfectly in motion. 2 miles away from the disastrous expo, parked directly along the curb outside Brielle's luxurious flagship downtown showroom, sat 3 heavy commercial trucks belonging to the civil sealing and inventory team. They were holding official court orders, waiting for my exact signal to drill the locks, chain the glass doors, and officially shutter the business forever. The board was completely cleared. The king and queen were captured. Then, shattering the quiet focus of my office, my personal cell phone began to vibrate against the mahogany conference table. The screen lit up with Brielle's name. Nolan Pike sat across from me, posture rigid, pen perfectly still. I stared at the glowing display for 1 measured second, then reached out and pressed the speakerphone button. Instantly, the quiet, air-conditioned calm of my office was obliterated by a deafening wall of pure, hysterical screaming. "You have to stop them right now!" Brielle shrieked, her voice cracking wildly, entirely stripped of its usual polished arrogance. She was hyperventilating, alternating between vicious profanities and pathetic, sobbing gasps. Through the audio feed, I could hear the chaotic background noise of her carefully constructed world completely disintegrating. She screamed that the civil asset recovery team was chaining the heavy glass doors of her flagship showroom. The inventory teams were boxing up her remaining stock right in the very middle of the expo day. Her elite clients were furiously demanding their massive cash deposits back and storming out of the convention center. Her entire staff had turned their backs and walked off the floor, leaving her entirely alone in the wreckage. "I am completely done for," she wailed, the sheer panic vibrating through the speaker. "Everything is being taken away from me. Call them off. Isla, call your lawyers and make them stop this right this second." I did not match her volume. I did not argue, And I did not gloat. I leaned forward and let my voice drop into a dead, freezing calm. Are you asking me to save you, Brielle? Or are you asking me to cover up your multiple felonies for the very first time in my entire 37 years of existence? My sister was rendered entirely speechless. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the line, broken only by her ragged, uneven breathing. When she finally spoke again, the venom and entitlement had completely evaporated, replaced by the pathetic, trembling tone of a terrified woman cornered in the dark. She began to beg. She confessed, sobbing heavily into the receiver, that she genuinely believed she could always force my hand. She thought I would forever remain the dutiful, compliant older sister who would clean up her catastrophic financial messes to protect the family name. Then came the final, sickening confession, the ultimate twist that completely validated every single defensive measure I had taken over the past 5 days. I just needed you to pay them off, Brielle wept, her voice barely a whisper. I thought if I made a massive, embarrassing scene at the charity gala, if I humiliated you in front of all those wealthy investors, you would just get angry and throw money at me to shut me up. You always throw money at the problem to keep the scandal quiet. I just needed you to write a check to make the embarrassment go away. She had deliberately orchestrated the physical assault. The slap in front of the entire gala was not a sudden loss of temper. It was a calculated, manipulative theatrical performance designed specifically to trigger my instinct to protect the family's public image. She wanted to create a crisis so loud and so publicly damaging that I would blindly hand over the capital just to buy back my own peace. She had tried to play the exact same script we had rehearsed for years, completely unaware that I had finally rewritten the ending. Across the table, Nolan Pike caught my eye. He gave a sharp, subtle nod, gesturing with his silver pen toward the active digital recorder capturing every single second of the call. Brielle had just voluntarily provided us with undeniable, supplementary audio evidence of her manipulative intent and her full conscious awareness of her own criminal wrongdoing. I will not intervene in a legal federal investigation, I told her, my voice resolute and entirely devoid of sympathy. I will not commit a crime to shield you from yours. You have exactly one path left. You will surrender every remaining ledger to the authorities. You will cooperate fully with the fraud division, and you will immediately stop lying to your innocent employees and your customers so we can mitigate the collateral damage you have caused. I reached out and ended the call. The silence that followed was the most peaceful sound I had heard in years. The days following that phone call moved with ruthless legal efficiency. Brielle is currently facing a massive civil lawsuit for total asset recovery, alongside severe looming criminal charges for wire fraud and forgery. She is no longer a glamorous chief executive officer. She is a disgraced defendant facing prison time. My mother, Diane, was unceremoniously forced to resign from the charity foundation in absolute disgrace. Her country club reputation permanently annihilated by her active complicity in the embezzlement. My father, Graham, who always prioritized his pristine image above his children, was publicly humiliated and forced to legally answer for his passive role in enabling the financial disaster. The family unit he fought so hard to protect with lies was shattered by the undeniable truth. Several months have passed since the doors of Lace and Ember Bridal were chained shut. I did not simply absorb the liquidated assets back into my personal portfolio. Instead, I restructured the recovered capital from her failed venture and established a new, heavily vetted financial grant program. It is a dedicated fund designed explicitly to support and empower young female entrepreneurs who operate their businesses with absolute transparency and ethical integrity. I no longer maintain the peace by throwing money into the dark. I maintain my boundaries through the law, and I maintain my self-respect by refusing to be a victim. I finally learned the most valuable lesson of my life: sharing a bloodline with someone is not a lifetime license for them to abuse your kindness. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support the channel by liking this video and turning on notifications so this story can reach more people.